I remember thinking to myself, and I don't know if I said this to myself yet, I probably have at some point, but this next phase of whatever could be talking myself out of the me. Talking myself through the illusion of being a me. And giving voice to whatever that is. In the moment, it's not continuous. Because I feel what happens is this discontinuity, this being sensitive to everything, and that creating an epiphenomenon of giving voice to something discontinuous, which is not a continuous me, translating everything according to the me. That process, that discontinuity, gets turned into a mental illness of the me. It gets turned into this person has personal problems. When speaking as something else, one might speak about problems, but not translate it into personal problems. Like this feeling of feeling the homeless people. That could be called a personal mental illness, or it could be called there is no me to have a mental illness. But when we're not operating based on that me, we can feel things and sense things that we sense that we're the whole of humanity. As Krishnamurti says, I am the world and the world is me. So if I only speak the language of me, can I speak the language of I am the world and the world is me? Something else I wanted to talk about from the book, The Possibility Principle, that I'm reading. It talks about how scientists discovered that beryllium atoms decayed more slowly the more they measured them. And so the writer points out that the active observation inexplicably changes the decay rate of the beryllium atoms. But I think this has more profound implications than that. It means that human attention slows the decay of something, and I've talked about how nature grows when we pay attention to it. So if we don't measure nature, if we don't look at it, if we don't observe it with our eyes, it decays faster. It goes away because nature appears to us as it does as we look at it. And the less we look at it and pay attention to it, not only does it decay faster, but we lose our ability to perceive its beauty and thus see that it has any value. And if we think it has no value, we just chop it all down. And he even says on a later page that elementary particles have a schizophrenic nature. He uses the word schizophrenic, and he says that they have a split personality, meaning they can be either a wave or a particle. And I think this provides a bit of a clue, because people who have this transconscious aspect, they're transconscious. They can have a consciousness that is in a wave possibility plane, and it can also be particulate. But what creates particles is the projection of the me, and there's less projection of the me when we are seeing possibilities. So we're seeing possibilities, or we're seeing with the me, which is our thought projection. And he talks about superposition states where things exist in all possibilities until we look at it, until we observe it. And that's what happens with people in this state of possibility, when they're in this state where their brain is in a superposition state. And based on how they're received and how they're observed, that's what collapses people into being mental patients. It's a most likely probability right now, based on people going into superposition states. What is possible is based on those who observe us. If people saw us as potential shamans, we would have a different future than if people saw us as crazy people. So they see that. So people who seem like crazy people in a shamanistic culture, to them, they don't see a crazy person, they see a possible shaman. Whereas same type of person in a Western culture is seen as a crazy person and is turned into a mental patient. So from that state, a person can be turned into almost anything, depending on how they're received and observed, because it's all possibilities and it depends on all the elements around that person. So if the elements around that person are there to turn them into a crazy person, which is what the psychiatric treadmill is all about, getting it caught in that amazement of psychiatry and being a mental patient. So that's the thing. How can we get turned into something else? Or how do we ensure we can get the heck out of that? Because it's only one possibility. And there's a lot of other possibilities likely than being a shaman, because not everybody can be a shaman that goes into these states of possibility. But people can maybe one day realize that they can create anything as possible as their life. They've gone into this place of possibility and they learn how to make things possible for themselves and other people. They become possibility makers and maybe are able to see what's possible for other people instead of other people projecting their images and their systems onto a person to make them into a mental patient. Maybe the person will look at somebody and say, you're supposed to be XYZ. I could do this in that state for a while, actually. I could see that person's unique genius. And just by looking at them, they would shift into their most beautiful light body self. So that gives that person that blueprint of themselves, whether they're aware of it or not. So yeah. So maybe others can be lit up by the light in the eyes of a possibility maker. Interlude. This is what possibility makers do by the way they look at people. They make things possible. Whereas when a psychiatrist looks at a possibility maker, they make the possibility maker into a mental patient because of the training, the knowledge coming out of their eyes onto that person. The psychiatric system prematurely collapses our wave function by telling us what to think and feel about ourselves and turning us into that with their medications and treatments. Anyways, I probably have more to say later, a little bit more. I'm making the video shorter because I have no more YouTube capture. And maybe I'm in a state of possibility right now. And this happens a lot lately where I'm doing something and I feel like I can see to the end of that, like, oh, I could make juice for people, or oh, I could do this. I see that anything is possible. And I'm seeing that in so-called positive situations. So then the other side comes in at some point and is like, well, it's just as possible to be a homeless person, so you better decide what it is that you want to do and say no to this homeless thing. And I do want to be the business owner, so I better not screw that up, because I want to be able to help make things possible for people that go into this state of possibility, see that there's other possibilities to their way of life, their way of living. And when we're in that state of possibility, we often get collapsed into crazy people because it's our me, it's our static, continuous self that makes things impossible for us because we're limited in that structure. And then when that structure is suspended so we can see other possibilities, the medical system is right there to say, where is yourself? Why aren't you being yourself? Why aren't you being continuous? Why aren't you being consistent? And then we get collapsed into being mental patients, a shadow of our former self, let alone expanding into all possibilities of ourselves. well, I'm glad I talked about this with myself, because I've gone from being a homeless person to being a person saying, screw that shit, in a short period of time. I was on the Daisy Project website, and I clicked through to a link to a website called psychrights.org. And it says on it, the public mental health system is creating a huge class of chronic mental patients through forcing them to take ineffective yet extremely harmful drugs. This is a really sad scenario. When I was driving home, I saw the full moon, and I'm sure that doesn't make anything better. This is an example of signs and synchronicity. Forget signs and symptoms of mental illness. Signs and synchronicity from the universe. And today after work, I was finished work at 3:30, but I didn't want to drive back in rush hour traffic, so I got some sushi, and then that's when I picked up the Common Ground magazine, and it was the article about the Daisy Project book, and this woman who escaped psychiatry after 38 years in its trap. And then I went back home, and I'm home now, and I listened to a 2-minute video on her blog, and she's using the same kind of languaging as I use. She says, I was trapped by psychiatry and escaped their clutches. And her book is called The Daisy Project, Escaping Psychiatry and Rediscovering Love. So it's interesting how someone is coming out of the woodwork saying things like escaping psychiatry. And she also says in the video she had a master's degree in nursing, so she was a nurse as well as a mental patient, so she knew, and this is her languaging exactly. She said, I learned how psychiatry traps and lures people into years of mental suffering. And she says, I also learned that it's possible to escape, and that's what she did. This poor woman, I wouldn't call being in it for 38 years escaping. Yes, it's finally escaping, but that's really awful. That's most of one's life. They've already extracted nearly all the profits off of her that they can. If she was diagnosed at 20 and then was in it 38 years, she barely escaped, because had she hit 60 and still been in that paradigm, she'd likely be dead. So how can we help people to escape sooner? 38 years. Another year or two and she wouldn't have made it to her 73rd birthday. She's 73 now, and I think she's been out of it for over 10 years, but she spent 38 years in the system. I'm seeing how we have many possible selves. Some of us have more than others, hence we're more invincible. Blah, blah, blah. I won't go into that now, but I can see it. I can see a lot more than I say, and there's more that I can see, but I don't say because I don't write it down to say, and it's obvious in the moment, but it's so infinite that it's gone the next to make way for the next subtly profound intimation from the universe. It's an elegant design.